All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how much you love philosophy, so today we're taking a look at Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah, it's a rich tradition.
Yeah.
And, we thought it would be really rewarding to dive into a particularly influential figure.
Absolutely. And the figure we've chosen is Vasubandhu, a Buddhist philosopher who lived in the 4th to 5th century CE.
And we're going to try to, sift through some of his dense and influential ideas to sort of extract what we think are the most interesting and philosophically compelling points.
Perfect. Now, to guide us in this exploration, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Vasubandhu.
Yeah, it's a really great resource. Really comprehensive, rigorously researched, so it allows us to navigate, the intricacies of his thought without hopefully, getting too bogged down.
So, what's the roadmap? What are we actually going to be looking at today? I think we're going to start by sort of sketching out the intellectual landscape that Vasubandhu was operating in, and then delve into some of the major arguments from his early masterpiece, The Treasury of the Abhidharma.
Right.
Then we'll explore his evolution into the Yogacara school,
Yep.
and then look at his approaches to interpreting Buddhist texts. And finally, sort of tackle the persistent question of whether his philosophy aligns with what we generally think of as idealism.
I think that that last point in particular is going to be really interesting for you as a philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be tracing the development of arguments that are very sophisticated and continue to, be important and resonate in contemporary discussions in metaphysics, epistemology, and the nature of reality itself.
All right, well, let's start at the beginning then. Who was this guy Vasubandhu who left such a lasting mark? Give us the historical and intellectual context.
Well, he flourished during the Gupta Empire in India. This was a period that's often considered a classical golden age. But what's immediately striking about Vasubandhu is the sheer breadth of his, intellectual engagement. He wasn't confined to a single Buddhist sect, but he demonstrated a deep and nuanced understanding of the diverse Buddhist and even non-Buddhist philosophical systems prevalent in his time.
So he's someone who's really engaging with the full spectrum of thought at the time.
Absolutely. And, his influence went on to permeate 3 distinct Buddhist scholastic traditions, the Vaihika, the Sautrantika, and the Yogacara.
Wow. So that speaks volumes about the power and adaptability of his thought.
Right. It wasn't just, specific to one school. It had wider application.
And his writings were key to that influence.
Right. Without question. His commentary on the Treasury of the Abhidharma, or Abhidharma is just a monumental work. For philosophers interested in Buddhist thought, it's the primary lens through which we understand non-Mahayana Abhidharma philosophy, particularly as it was received and debated in Tibetan and East Asian Buddhist schools for centuries.
So that's his initial engagement with Abhidharma, right? But how did his thinking evolve into the Yogacara school? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so later in his career, he authored a series of really concise but also really profound treatises on Yogacara philosophy.
Okay.
And, these works set a new standard. And they essentially established Yogacara as the dominant form of Buddhist metaphysics in India for like 500 years.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, a truly transformative figure. But, the entry also mentions that he's been a subject of ongoing debate throughout Buddhist history. So for philosophers of Buddhism, what are the core points of contention here? What's been debated?
Yeah, what's the controversy?
It's important because despite this immense authority that he has, his legacy is still marked by a degree of controversy.
Oh, really? Even like the story of his life, his biography is uncertain.
Yes. Even the details of his life are, contested, not without some disagreement.
That's interesting. What are the big ones, the big disagreements?
Well, traditional accounts, such as that of the later scholar Paramartha, portray Vasubandhu as a tutor to the crown prince and queen. During the reign of King Vikramaditya, who's generally identified with the Gupta ruler, Chandragupta II. So that places him firmly in a historical context.
Right.
And they put him at the center of the intellectual ferment of his era.
Yeah.
So he gained renown as a really sharp author and just a really formidable debater.
So really someone who was at the heart of all the interesting philosophical debates of his time.
Exactly. And that's why his writings are so valuable for us, because they offer these really critical engagements with the dominant Buddhist and Hindu viewpoints. So, they're a great resource for understanding the thought of that period.
What about his education? The entry mentions some time in Kashmir, right?
Yes. So the story goes that as a young and ambitious monk, he journeyed from his native Gandhara to Kashmir, which was a stronghold of the Vaibhava school and Abhiharma teachings at the time.
Right.
And, the students there were bound by these strict rules of secrecy regarding their doctrinal tenets.
Sounds like a pretty, interesting environment to learn in.
It was.
Yeah.
And, it seems that Vasubandhu's questioning of Vaibhava orthodoxy didn't exactly endear him to everyone.
I can imagine.
Nevertheless, he returned home with this comprehensive understanding of their system. But this is where it gets, this is where the narrative gets really interesting for us as intellectual historians.
Yeah.
Upon returning home, he immediately sort of broke with the Kashmiri tradition by offering these public teachings on the very doctrines that, he had studied.
Yes.
And he even issued daily challenges for debate.
That's a pretty bold move.
It is.
Likely to make some enemies, too.
Yeah.
Especially if they're sworn to secrecy.
Yeah. The Kashmiri colleagues were quite incensed, by this public dissemination of their guarded knowledge.
Yeah.
But the story goes that their anger subsided when they received a copy of the root verses of his treasury of the Abhidharma.
Mm-hmm.
It was like this concise and brilliant summary of their complex system. And they actually praised it immensely.
So a temporary reconciliation.
Right, exactly. But then the peace was short-lived. Because when Vasubandhu subsequently published his own extensive commentary on these very verses, he introduced these numerous critiques of the Vaibhava system.
Mm-hmm.
And presented arguments that aligned with the Sautrantika perspective.
So going against them again.
Yeah. And as you can imagine, this reignited the fury of his Kashmiri peers.
The drama continues.
Yes, it does. Years later, a contemporary Vaibhava scholar by the name of Sagavadra dedicated a significant amount of effort to composing 2 treatises that were specifically aimed at refuting Vasubandhu's commentary.
Oh, wow.
He even traveled to Ayodhya, where Vasubandhu was residing under royal patronage, with the intention of engaging him in a public debate.
Mm-hmm.
Vasubandhu famously declined the challenge.
Oh, okay. So this big intellectual clash and then kind of a whimper of an ending.
Exactly. But the whole narrative is primarily derived from Chinese and Tibetan sources. Mm. And it offers a potential explanation for why Vasubandhu's commentary, often diverges in its philosophical positions for the doctrines that are presented in the original verses of the Treasury. So it might not have been conceived as a unified and seamless exposition from the beginning.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So what about the pivotal moment of his alleged conversion to Yogacara? The entry mentions this influence of his elder half-brother, Asinga.
Yeah, so this is another really interesting point. So his elder half-brother, Asinga, is, also a monumental figure in the development of Mahayana Buddhism.
Right.
So the tradition has it that he spent 12 years in intense solitary meditation. And during this time, he received direct teachings from Maitreya, who is, the future Buddha. Mm-hmm. And Asya went on to become the primary systematizer and expounder of the Yogacara synthesis of Mahayana thought. So he was a really powerful, spiritual and intellectual influence, even within Vasubandhu's own family.
Right.
He authored a vast body of work and also transmitted texts believed to have been, revealed to him by Maitreya.
Okay.
Later in life, it said that he grew concerned about Vasubandhu's philosophical trajectory.
Oh, really?
Yeah, particularly because Vasubandhu had publicly critiqued some of Asaga's earlier works.
So a family drama playing out in the realm of philosophy.
Precisely. So Asoga dispatched his own disciples, to engage with Vasubandhu, to try and persuade him to embrace the Yogacara system. And according to, the traditional accounts, this intervention was successful. Leading Vasubandhu to author numerous texts from a Yogacara perspective. After, he had earlier articulated these non-Mahayana viewpoints. So this narrative sort of serves to connect the author of the Treasury with, the later commentaries on Mahayana scriptures and his subsequent Yogacara syntheses.
But the entry also alludes to this, modern scholarly skepticism regarding this conversion narrative and even the very notion of a singular Vasubandhu, which for us as philosophers of intellectual history, raises significant questions about authorship and the evolution of ideas.
Right, exactly. So the traditional biographies, have sometimes hagiographic elements, sometimes contradictory elements. This has led many scholars to sort of question the historical accuracy of these narratives. Is it even possible that a single person could have produced such a huge number and variety of texts
Right.
that are attributed to Vasubandhu across the Tibetan and Chinese Buddhist canons?
That brings us to the two Vasubandhus theory. Right?
Exactly. So in the 1950s, Erich Frauwallner proposed this hypothesis
Right.
that there were actually two distinct historical figures named Vasubandhu,
Oh, wow.
and that the traditional biographies sort of conflated them
Okay.
into a single person. And this theory and variations of it continue to have a lot of support in academic circles.
So this would offer compelling explanation for why we see shifts in philosophical perspective across his work.
It would. And, some scholars also challenge this sort of straightforward narrative of a sudden conversion to Yogacara under Asauga's direct influence, and suggest that it was more of a gradual and organic evolution of his thought. They see these common threads and underlying principles that connect these works that traditionally have been seen as belonging to entirely separate phases of his intellectual life.
Okay, so more of a nuanced picture rather than just this, black and white conversion.
Exactly. Some scholars, like Robert Kritzer, have even argued that Vasubandhu might have, held a secret affinity for Yogacara ideas even while he was working on the treasury. So it might have been a more subtle and perhaps even strategic unfolding of his philosophical vision.
That's a very interesting point. So ultimately, can we really say that all of this extant material, all of these texts we have, are from a single person?
That's hard to say. That's a big issue.
Yeah, it's an open question.
It is.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing issue in the field.
So let's move on to his doctrinal positions and key works. The entry emphasized, that Vasubandhu engaged with and wrote from multiple philosophical perspectives, which, again, as a philosopher, I find really fascinating.
Right.
He wasn't just stuck to one dogma.
Right. Yeah, this is a really crucial point. He wasn't someone who simply adhered to a single dogma.
Right.
His writings often meticulously present and then rigorously critique, opposing arguments.
Yeah.
That's why his commentary on the treasury of the Abhidharma is so great. It's invaluable for understanding the diverse range of Buddhist and non-Buddhist philosophical viewpoints of his day.
Right.
So, for a philosopher today, this is gold, this rigorous engagement with a multiplicity of perspectives.
Absolutely. So which specific school of thought did he engage with most prominently in his work?
Well, the primary Buddhist schools are the Vaifikas, or Sarvastivadins of Kashmir and Gandhara.
Okay.
The Vatsiputriyas, also known as the Pudgalavans or personalists. The Sautrantikas, sometimes referred to as Dhartantikas.
Yeah.
And, of course, the Yogacarans. And beyond the Buddhist realm, he also engaged with some influential non-Buddhist schools,
Right.
specifically Orthodox Hindu schools,
Yeah.
most notably Sakya and Nayavaishenka.
So were there any particular schools, out of all of these with which he consistently disagreed?
Yeah, it seems that the one Buddhist school that he consistently really took issue with was the Vatsiputriyas, or the personalists.
Yeah.
Their distinctive concept of a person, or Pudgala, as being neither identical to nor entirely distinct from the five aggregates, was a frequent target of his critiques.
Okay. And as we know, his own evolving philosophical commitments led him to associate more closely with the Sautrantika and later Yogacara perspectives. How does this manifest in his writing?
Right. So his works are generally categorized as being written from either a Sautrantika or a Yogacara standpoint. But, it's really important to remember that the foundational verses of his treasury of the Abhidharma actually provide a systematic summary of the core doctrines of the Kashmiri Vaibhishka school.
Okay.
It's really in his own extensive commentary on those verses where the Sautrantika system often gains prominence through his arguments and alternative interpretations. But even within that commentary, some Vaibhika views are still presented without direct refutation.
So the treasury and the commentary offer this, fascinating picture of a philosopher engaging critically with a system, both from within and without.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, it presents one established system, and then the commentary sort of subjects it to, a rigorous scrutiny from a different perspective, but still a related perspective. And it's that multi-layered approach that makes it such a really rich philosophical document.
And you mentioned earlier the importance of Vasubandhu's work for our understanding of Shravaka Abhidharma. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why are his contributions so crucial for studying, the history of early Buddhist philosophy?
Yeah, so this is a vital point.
Right.
While we have a substantial collection of Abhidharma texts from the Theravada tradition preserved in Pali,
Right.
and a significant corpus of Sarvastivada Abhidharma texts that have survived in Chinese translations, nearly all of the Shravaka Abhidharma texts that remain, either in their original Sanskrit or in Tibetan translations, are either the direct works of Vasubandhu or they belong to the commentarial traditions that emerged directly from his scholarship.
Wow.
So in many respects, our access to and understanding of these earlier schools of Buddhist philosophy is largely mediated through his interpretations and summaries. And this carries significant implications for how we reconstruct the history of Buddhist thought.
Absolutely. It is a testament to his philosophical, dominance.
It is.
But it could also perhaps reflect the increasing influence and eventual ascendancy of the Yogacara school itself, which maybe led to, a neglect of those other traditions.
Right.
The fact that we have so little material left.
Exactly. And you could even say that he sort of paved the way, right?
Yeah.
For this widespread acceptance of Mahayana ideas.
Yeah.
By really articulating these arguments and doctrines.
Now, aside from the monumental treasury, are there any other key works of Vasubandhu that you would sort of highlight for a philosopher?
Yeah, there are many. But some particularly significant ones are his Yogacara syntheses, the 20 verses, or Vishakarika.
Okay.
Along with, his commentary on that. The 30 verses, or Trishika, and the Three Natures Exposition, or Tisvahavanirdish. So those three texts are absolutely essential reading.
Okay.
For understanding the core tenets of his Yogacara philosophy and, his distinctive approach to metaphysics and epistemology.
And the entry also listed some shorter, independent works, as well as his extensive commentaries on other important scriptures.
Right.
Are there any of those that you would highlight?
Yeah, so his explanation of the establishment of action, or karma siddha prakaran, is a crucial work. It synthesizes his views on, how karma works, and it introduces a defense of the alaya vijnana, or storehouse consciousness, which is a very central concept in Yogacara.
Okay.
There's also the explanation of the 5 aggregates, or panyaskanda prakaran. It provides a really nice, concise summary of some, key Abhidharma terminology, while incorporating some distinctive Yogacara perspectives.
Yeah.
And his proper mode of exposition, or Vyakyukti, is also particularly fascinating for philosophers.
Yeah, and why is that?
It delves into the principles of interpreting Buddhist scriptures.
Okay.
It even offers arguments defending the legitimacy of the Mahayana Sutras, which was a topic of debate at the time.
What?
And he also authored highly influential commentaries on works believed to have been revealed to Asagga by Maitreya.
Right.
Like the commentary on distinguishing elements from reality, or Dharmadharmata Vibhagati.
Right.
The commentary on distinguishing the middle from the extremes, or Matyanta Vibhagavya.
Okay.
And the commentary on the ornament to the great vehicle discourses, or Mahayana Sutra Karavaya. And he's also credited with a really significant and influential commentary on Asagga's comprehensive Yogacara treatise, the summary of the great vehicle, called the Mayandasi Garabhaita.
So this is clearly a truly astonishing body of work, but both in terms of, quantity and influence, but, as we touched upon earlier, sheer volume and range of perspectives that we find sometimes leads to scholarly skepticism about whether all this material could really come from a single individual.
Right.
And it reminds us as philosophers that we need to, approach even the most influential thinkers with a critical eye.
Right, exactly.
Toward the complexities of intellectual history and textual attribution. So, let's move on.
Okay.
To the philosophical meat of this deep dive. Let's look at some of the major arguments presented in the treasury of the Abhidharma. And the first one that our source highlights is this disproof of the self.
Yes.
A cornerstone of Buddhist philosophy that continues to spark debate even today.
Absolutely.
In Western philosophy.
Yeah. So the concluding chapter of his commentary on the treasury of the Abhidharma offers an extensive defense of the no-self doctrine.
Okay.
It's appropriately titled The Refutation of the Person. And it seems that his primary target in this section is a Buddhist audience.
Okay.
He wants to show that no Buddhist should accept the existence of a permanent, independent self, or Atman, or a person, or Pudgala, as something fundamentally distinct from the five aggregates or skandhas that constitute our experience.
Right. And for a listener who, might be interested in this question of identity, can you just remind us of the five aggregates?
Yeah, certainly. So according to the Buddhist teachings, what we commonly perceive as a stable, enduring self is actually just a temporary and ever-changing collection of five interconnected aggregates.
Okay.
So there's the aggregate of physical form or matter or rupa, the aggregate of feelings or sensations or vedana, the aggregate of perceptions or ideas or saijja, the aggregate of mental formations or dispositions or satskara, and the aggregate of consciousness or vijnana. So, the core Buddhist insight is that there's no permanent independent entity that underlies or unifies these, constantly shifting components of our experience.
Right. So everything is constantly changing.
Exactly.
Now, you said that Vasubandhu was primarily targeting a Buddhist audience here, and he saw the personalists, the Vatsiputriyas, as a significant group within Buddhism who held a divergent view.
Yeah. So he saw them as a key Buddhist interlocutor that posited the existence of a person, Pudgala, that was neither entirely identical to nor completely separate from the five aggregates.
Yeah.
Later in the chapter, he also directs some of his arguments toward, a Hindu-Vaishika conception of a more substantial self.
Okay, so what's the core of his argument? What's his main point against the self, against the person?
So he begins by really underscoring the soteriological significance of this stance. He argues that for those outside the Buddhist framework who cling to this idea of a permanent independent self, liberation is simply impossible.
Right.
Because it's that very act of self-grasping.
Yeah.
That's the root of mental afflictions.
Right.
And the perpetuation of this cycle of rebirth.
So this isn't just some sort of abstract metaphysical debate for him, right?
Right, exactly.
This has very real implications.
Precisely.
For Buddhist practice, for the goal of liberation.
Absolutely. And then he goes on to offer this systematic demonstration of the non-existence of the self. His argument rests on the premise that anything that exists and is real can be known through two primary means, either direct perception or valid inference.
Okay.
So he meticulously enumerates 7 types of entities that are known through perception, including, the 5 external sense objects, internal mental objects, and the faculty of mind itself.
Right.
And then he says that the purported self or person cannot be apprehended through either of these means. We don't have any direct experience of a separate enduring self distinct from the ever-changing flow of our mental and physical states.
Right.
And, nor can we establish its existence through any sort of sound logical inference.
Right. It can't be perceived and it can't be inferred.
Exactly. And, as you mentioned, he's also really committed to this doctrine of universal momentariness.
Yeah, I was going to say, how does this play into, the arguments against the self? Because if everything is just a momentary blip, then, the idea of a persistent self seems really problematic.
Exactly. It reinforces the idea of, there being no enduring I.
Right.
He would say that any attempt to, to infer the existence of the self from a momentary mental event, like, Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
It's just fundamentally flawed. Because for Vasubandhu, all phenomena, including mental states, they're in a state of constant flux. They arise and cease instantaneously. So there's no room for this sort of persistent I.
And he connects this argument against the self to the Buddhist understanding of the 12 sense spaces as well.
Yes. He implicitly suggests that by establishing the reality of the 12 sense spaces.
Okay.
These are the 5 external sense organs and their corresponding objects, along with the mind and mental objects.
Okay.
He's effectively accounted for everything the Buddhists consider real,
right,
in the empirical domain of a living being.
Mm-hmm.
And, these sense spaces can be mapped onto the 5 aggregates.
Right.
So the self just has no place in this system.
And it's fascinating how he sort of balances this, this counterintuitive idea that there is no self with the, the argument that it's still philosophically and soteriologically necessary to take that view.
Exactly.
So how does he address that?
Well, he, readily admits that this this doctrine clashes with our intuition. If the truth were obvious, he says, then the path to enlightenment would be a lot easier.
Right.
So he directly addresses, these common doubts and objections that people have.
Okay.
How can there be continuity of personal identity? How do names and pronouns work?
Mm-hmm.
Who is the agent? Memory, transmigration, karma. All of these questions come up. And, while he doesn't get into all the details right away, he does lay the groundwork for later explanations.
Mm.
His focus here is really on highlighting the philosophical advantages of the no-self view.
Right.
And, exposing the inherent difficulties of positing the existence of a self.
Right.
Especially as it's, articulated by the personalists.
Yeah. And his distinction between what's real dravya and what's a conceptual construct, pratyapti or perikalpita, seems really key to all of this.
Absolutely. So for Vasubandhu, anything that possesses genuine reality or substantial existence or dravya must be causally efficacious. So it has to be able to produce effects.
Okay, so it has to be able to do something, to cause something.
Right. And anything that lacks this is unreal. It's just a conceptual designation.
A label. Yeah.
Or a mental fabrication, pratyapti or perikalpita.
Okay.
And he firmly places the person, the self, the idea of a self, in this latter category.
Right.
And so it's removed from this dynamic flow of causality that is the real.
Okay. And he uses this really interesting analogy of milk to sort of illustrate this.
Right. He says, just as the concept of milk is a useful mental construct that we apply to, a collection of sense impressions.
Right.
Like taste, smell, and visual appearance, the idea of a stable, enduring self is also a conceptual unity.
Okay.
That we mistakenly project onto these constantly changing and interconnected elements of our experience.
Yeah.
So the underlying sense impressions are real, they're active, but the enduring unified I is not really an entity in the same way.
So what about the personalist view that the person, while not being the same as the aggregates, nevertheless depends upon them? How does he address that?
Yeah, so Vasubandhu sees this depending upon as an untenable attempt to reconcile ideas that are just fundamentally incompatible.
Okay.
So if depending upon simply means that, we can't even conceive of a person without the aggregates.
Right.